things don't always go as we hope that they will. In 1914, just after the outbreak of World War I, H.G. Wells coined the phrase, "the war to end war," or as it's later become, the war to end all wars. And many began at that time to hope that the horrific suffering and loss of the Great War would bring people and nations to their senses, and there would be no more war. But of course, just 20 years after that conflict ended, World War II erupted another terrible struggle that would kill and wound millions, that would destroy economies and wreck the hopes and the plans and the families of so many. And things don't always go well in our own day either, do they? We've seen that on a global scale in the last 18 months as a new virus, and our response to it has brought great suffering and disrupted the lives and plans of nearly everybody. And it just seems that nothing is as certain or as stable as it felt 2 years ago. Tensions between nations and different groups of people rumble on. The world, to be honest, seems no closer to being a family of nations that can live at peace with each other. And actually, you don't really need to look out all the way out into the world to see this. You just need to look around. Look around the village to see families rocked by illness and death or broken relationships, to see people worried about money or jobs or the outlook for their own children. How do people respond when things don't work out as they hoped they would? Some people are angry at others, angry at the system, perhaps angry at God. Some people kind of sink into despair, unable to see any way out of their troubles. They just start to lose all hope. Others have a cheerful optimism, but sometimes you wonder what it's grounded on. You know, the sort of person who just says, well, everything's going to work out okay in the end, as they reach out and touch wood or whatever it is they do. Whether you're at the kind of no hope end or the, what you might call the false hope end of the reaction, is there another way of reacting when things don't turn out as we'd hoped they would? Well, the writer of the book of Lamentations definitely has a different reaction. Things had not gone as he had hoped. He lived at a time of great national disaster. The Israelite nation that had once been powerful and wealthy and glorious had suffered years, centuries of decline until they could no longer stand up to the might of the Babylonian Empire. And in 586 BC, their nation was overthrown. Jerusalem was destroyed. The king and many other people were dragged off into exile. And that's the setting for this book. It's, the clue's in the title, Lamentations. It's a lament. It's a grief-filled poem. If you just flip back just one page to the very first verses of the book. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are upon her cheeks. Many people have thought that the writer of the book might well be the prophet Jeremiah, and I think that's a reasonable guess. I'll go with that. Jeremiah, if it is him, writes this poem full of deep anguish and sadness. He lives in a broken nation. There are buckets of tears. And yet, amazingly, he has this solid hope for the future, a hope in the midst of suffering. And I suggest to you it's something that we can learn from. What is it that enables Jeremiah to have this hope? Two things, and maybe the first one will surprise you. He believes in God's judgment. That's what leads him to have hope. He believes in God's judgment. If we were going to think like Jeremiah, we would need to be the kind of people who ask, do I deserve this, Lord, when things are not going right? Are the things happening to me my fault? Are the things happening to our nation, are they our fault? Now, we need to be really careful about not being simplistic about this. Jesus' disciples once came across a blind man, and they assumed that this man's blindness must have been caused by something he'd done in his life or by the sin of his parents. And Jesus said, no, it's not either of those. So we can't make those kind of assumptions. We need to be very careful not to assume that others deserve the bad things that are happening to them. And we mustn't think that something bad that we did must be the reason for the difficult time we're going through. But on the other hand, there's a whole army of education and professionals and health professionals out there who will tell you that whatever has gone wrong in your life, you must never blame yourself. And the Bible wouldn't agree with that either. Jeremiah knows that there might well be a reason for the trouble that's come on him and his nation. In fact, he believes that someone has caused this trouble. It's not just random forces in the world. If you look at the beginning of chapter 3 on page 825 there, you see what he says. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. Who is the his? He. Who is the he? He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. Is he talking about the Babylonians? Is he talking about some other people in his country? He's not. If you go back, just look across the page, chapter 2, verse 5, you'll see who he's talking about. He's talking about God himself. Chapter 2, verse 5, the Lord is like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all her palaces and destroyed her strongholds. He has multiplied mourning and lamentation for the daughter of Judah. And why? Because God's people have not done everything that he wanted them to do. In fact, they've done everything he told them not to do. They've ignored God's commands. They've lived as they want. They've decided for themselves what is right and what is wrong. They've forgotten God's goodness to them in the past. They've lost their love for their God, the God who made them and called them his own. And God had told them what would happen if they did this. He'd said that their national life would collapse at every level. Their enemies would prove too strong for them. Their cities would be destroyed. And that's exactly what happened. So it's clear to Jeremiah as he writes this that they did deserve this. They brought it on themselves. What would Jeremiah say if he was here, if he could stand here today and speak to us? Would he not say we've done the same to God as a nation? We've ignored his commands, we've lived as we wanted, we've forgotten God's goodness in the past, we've lost our love for him. Wouldn't Jeremiah remind us that you do know the Lord of heaven and earth judges people and nations? I know today's skeptics will say that's silly, that's nonsense. Maybe God doesn't exist. Or if he does exist, surely he doesn't do things like that. He's a nice guy in the sky. He doesn't really mind whether you love him or ignore him. He won't or he can't do anything against you. But you know, don't you, that puts us completely out of step with, I think, every generation that's gone before us. The generations in the past built churches because they knew it mattered whether a people or a nation worshipped God or not. They learnt the 10 Commandments and they painted them on church walls because they knew that God's commands mattered. They gathered to pray when war threatened because they knew who had the power to send disaster or to give peace. And if we're really just going to walk away from all that in our generation, are we really going to do that without expecting consequences? We need to be asking, do I deserve what's happening to me? Do we deserve what's happening to us as a nation? Could it be the Lord's work that things are so difficult? And if the answer might be yes, well, where do we turn? Is there a way out? That's the amazing thing. Jeremiah is convinced the answer is yes. God has brought this judgment on his people. And that's what gives him hope. You just think about it for a minute. If God has brought the judgment, then God can remove it. If it was nothing to do with him, then why turn to God for help? If somehow all the bad things that had happened to Israel happened when God was asleep, or he didn't want them to happen but he couldn't do anything about it, then why turn to him? But if he's the one who's brought the trouble, then it makes sense to turn to him, to have hope that he might be willing to turn it round. If God has brought us suffering, then God has the power to deliver us from it. And that's why this amazing little center of the book, chapter 3, verse 21, perhaps is not as surprising as we might initially think. Have a look here. It says just over the page, chapter 3. Let me read from verse 19. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. We're not it's not all gone. We're not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore I will wait for him. We, of course, we make promises, we make commitments, and then we struggle to keep them. But God is faithful. He's faithful to his promises. He's faithful to the people who belong to him. And because of his deep and lasting love, those who turn to him are not consumed, but discover mercy, forgiveness, a new life. If his people turn away from him and ignore his words, then yes, we must expect to suffer the consequences that he has promised. But if we turn back in genuine sorrow, if we will let go of coldness towards God, then we will find that he is ready to do good to us. He has not given up on us. When C.S. Lewis wrote the Narnia stories, he decided that the character in his books who was going to represent Jesus should be a lion. And I think it was a good choice. Aslan is a scary cat. He's not a cuddly cat. He's not domesticated. He's not tame. He has power and authority. But the children realize that Aslan loves them, and they learn to trust his loving kindness. And in the end, and in a way that they can't fully understand, his death on the stone altar is what rescues them and gives them life. The lion lays down his life for his friends. Jesus is a lion. He's not a mouse. If you're in any doubt about that, have another read of the Gospels. If you've not read them recently, let me suggest Mark's Gospel. It's the shortest, but it's perhaps the one where the clear authority of Jesus comes through. I've left some copies on the table there at the back. If you'd like to pick one up, just take one on your way out. Jesus speaks and acts as someone who has kingly authority. You read about how he commands people, how he commands the forces of nature, sickness, demons, even death. They all obey him. He tells people that God, his Father, has appointed him as judge of the world, and that he will one day separate people according to how we have responded to him and his words and his kindness. You do not want to fall into the paws of this lion. He will tear you apart. But turn to the lion, turn back to Jesus, and you'll discover that his commitment to you is unshakable. There's nothing he won't do for you. Jesus said, "Greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." That is a sacrifice that many men from Burton made in the past for their friends, for their countrymen. They were following in the footsteps of Jesus, who paid the price that allows us to be reconciled to him and to his Father. Jesus says, "For your tomorrow, I gave my today." Do we deserve whatever disaster we might face as a nation? Do we deserve whatever disaster God might send on our nation? I think we do. Is there a way out, though? Yes, there is. There's a way out for us as individuals. There's a way out for us as a country. But it's a way that depends on us putting our trust once again in God's mercy. We have to stop paying lip service to Jesus. We have to start living under his loving authority so that there's no doubt who's truly in charge of our lives, of our families, of our nation. This I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Should we pray together?